What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Mean Streets of Gadgetzan is in full swing now, and a lot of people have been really happy with how diverse and balanced the standard format has turned out to be so far. Still though, things weren't always that way, especially in the alpha and beta phase when some really crazy overpowered decks existed. But one of the worst offenders was the deck that had charging 0 mana 8/8 minions. That's right, it's Molten Giant OTK Warrior, and today we're going to be taking a look back into the history books and talking about just how OP this deck used to be. So let's jump right into it. First off, let's talk a little bit about how the deck worked. So the basic premise was to draw cards and to use removal to stall long enough until you had all the combo pieces that you needed and were also at a life total low enough where you got free or at least relatively cheap enough Molten Giants to play. After both of those conditions were met, you could kill your opponent with charging Molten Giants with a bunch of different ways actually. And there were a lot of cards that made these combos possible, a lot of which have been nerfed or changed since then, and overall it made the deck really consistent since there were so many different ways that you could pull off the combo properly. So first up we have Molten Giant, which is of course pretty much the namesake of the deck. So a lot of you guys probably know the nerf to Molten Giant since it was pretty recent, and Molten Giant used to cost 20 mana instead of 25, meaning that you could cast it at 0 for 10 or less life, rather than being at 5 or less life, which of course makes a huge difference since if the deck originally had the nerfed version of Molten Giant, it would have been a lot harder to combo off, certainly a lot riskier as well. But the main guy that made, or at least enabled the combos was of course Warsong Commander, which was the main way to give your Molten Giants charge in the deck. Now Warsong Commander has actually been nerfed quite a few times, but the version back in the day that made the deck super OP was the 2/3 minion that gave all of your other minions charge. So yeah, all of your other minions. There was no less than 3 attack clause, no restrictions, nothing whatsoever really. You would give everything and anything charge. Now imagine if that card hadn't actually been changed. You could have done things like Warsong Commander with Dr. Boom for a charging Dr. Boom, charging Boom bots, and really that's not even close to the most broken thing you would have been able to do with the old Warsong Commander. Now Warsong Commander did of course get nerfed in the closed beta, and after that it no longer worked with Molten Giants, but during the time it gave everything charge, it was really broken, and the Molten Giant OTK deck is really what got the card nerfed in the first place. There were other ways though to give your Molten Giants charge, the other one being the literal card charge itself. Now charge has actually gone through some pretty broken iterations as well before settling at a 3 mana spell version and then being changed again pretty recently. In the early alpha phase, charge originally read as give your minions charge this turn and cost 0 mana, so it was essentially the Warsong Commander effect on a 0 mana spell. And it's definitely pretty easy to see why that would be really broken. Now there were a lot of really broken things in the alpha, and Molten Giant OTK didn't actually really become popular or at least discovered until the beta after charge had been nerfed once at least, but it's pretty crazy to think about what could have happened if the deck had access to this really OP version of charge. In an early alpha patch, charge was nerfed to just being able to give a single minion charge and costing 0 mana, which was actually still pretty OP, since it let you do some crazy things with Molten Giants and faceless manipulators, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Charge was actually nerfed again in the same patch that Warsong Commander was, to later cost 3 mana, along with the Warsong nerf, which pretty much killed the deck, although it's maybe resurfaced a few times since then, especially when Emperor Thaurissan came out. So now that we've established some of the pre-nerf cards that the deck had access to, let's put it all together and take a look at just how broken the deck really was. So Molten Giant OTK actually had quite a few ways of going off, depending on the deck list you were playing and the actual draws that you happened to get. So the most common way was to play Warsong Commander, play a free costing or usually 1 mana or 2 mana costing Molten Giant, and then you would attack face, then you would bounce the Molten Giant to your hand using a youthful Brewmaster. And since all of your minions have charge and the Molten Giant costs very little mana, you could just replay it and then attack with it again and attack with it again. So you would need 2 Brewmasters, 1 or 2 Molten Giants, and a Warsong Commander, and that could give you upwards of 38 damage. 32 from the Molten Giants potentially, and 6 from the Brewmasters. Although generally the opponent would already have taken some damage of course, and you wouldn't really need 38 damage is the thing. So you could definitely pull off the combos with 1 Molten Giant instead of 2, or, you know, there's a lot of different ways to do it. So another way to maybe go off would be to play a Molten Giant, give it charge using the spell charge or Warsong Commander or something like that, and then you could play a Faceless Manipulator on it once or twice. And since Molten Giant and the old version of charge cost 0 mana actually, you could Faceless the charge Molten twice, and you could get 3 charging Molten Giants and combo your opponent for 24 damage for 10 mana from your hand. You could obviously, of course, mix and match all of these combos, you know, tossing in a Faceless Molten with your Warsong, just straight casting charge on 2 different Molten Giants, and the rest of the deck had a lot of weapons so that you could potentially decrease your life total if you wanted to get cheaper Molten Giants, stuff like War Axe, Gorehowl, if you just wanted to control the board as well, and it had tons of card draw to find your combo pieces, playing cards like Acolyte of Pain, Cold Light Oracle as well actually, to be able to dig through the deck, and the deck also played a lot of cards that would damage your own self like Abomination and Baron Geddon, which were actually kind of just decent cards to play at the time, but they also damage your own face a little bit more to make it so that your opponent couldn't play around your Molten Giants whatsoever. And the remaining cards were all pretty much standard warrior removal. You know, you got the Brawls, the Shield Slams, the Executes, and all sorts of good stuff. A lot of people also played Alexstrasza, which could be used to make it easier to kill your opponent, or most of the time to actually set your own life total to 15, and then you could attack a minion with a weapon so that you could instantly get free Molten Giants and just combo off. And there's definitely a lot of things altogether that made the deck so broken. You know, any deck that can kill the opponent from an empty board at a full life total pretty much automatically does get into the territory of potentially being broken. And the thing is that Molten Giant Warrior not only did it so consistently, but they also had insane survivability in the early game. It was like really played a lot like Control Warrior, but instead of having to win in fatigue or carefully conserve and use your resources, you just stall a few turns and eventually you just kill your opponent instantly. Additionally, this kind of combo was very resilient to any sort of counters, since it was all from your hand in the first place, and you would often have enough damage or mana or spells left over to clear taunts, because you don't have to deal 38 damage. Most of the time you don't even have to deal 30, sometimes not even 20. So you're able to, you know, remove a taunt as well as playing the combo in the same turn, whether with some of your chargers or maybe with like a Shield Slam or an Execute or something like that. And the other awesome thing that made this deck so powerful was that the aggro matchup was really solid, which is usually the big weakness for combo decks. You know, not only do you have amazing tools with all your standard warrior removal and armor and stuff, but the combo itself punishes the opponent from being too aggressive because it revolves around Molten Giants. And aggro decks often damage themselves like their own face as well, whether through attacking your taunts with their weapons or doing things like life tap. And so if they got their own life total a little bit too low, it was really easy to put together just a few cards to be able to combo out your opponent and kill them, or at least put yourself in a really good position. And the matchups that this deck had were honestly just insane. You know, of course it beats every slow control deck, and as a result, you know, overall Molten Giant OTK did really well against pretty much just every single matchup if you were playing it effectively. And it had access to a lot of really overpowered tools that later got nerfed, and was probably one of the best OTK decks in Hearthstone history altogether. So those were some of the card changes and strategies that made Molten Giant OTK Warrior super overpowered. Definitely let us know what your thoughts on this deck were in the comments section below. Either way, it looks like that's gonna be it from me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.